Okay, so last but certainly not least, again from the US, we have Dr. Julie McGurk and Dr. Jamiella Brooks. Julie is from Yale University and Jamiella is from the University of Pennsylvania. And they're going to talk to you today about rigor as inclusive practice. So firstly, thank you both for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to start just by, I think this is fantastic to follow through from the works of our previous colleagues, because this leads right into some of the difficulties for applying inclusive practice, which is the question of what happens when we apply rigor. And I think everyone wants their universities and wants their classroom experiences to be rigorous. But the question then becomes, how is that term applied and coded in different kinds of inequitable ways? And so today we're going to be challenging all of ourselves actually to be coming up with ideas about a rigorous definition of the term rigor and ensuring that we're applying it in a way that's actually going to be helpful and inclusive to our students rather to the contrary. And some examples of that is, the ideas that, when we're thinking about rigor, we might say, oh, well, students are not thinking critically enough, they're not working hard enough, they come in underprepared. And we'd like to flip that on its head and actually think about and take a step back to think about where our classes actually are usefully rigorous and where they are not. So we can go on to the next slide. So our goals is we're hoping in this very short time to just give a couple of examples demonstrating the relationship between rigor and equity and inclusion. And we're hoping to think through, just brainstorm some strategies for enacting rigor while supporting students in changing contexts, particularly this online learning environment. And to just speak briefly to where this workshop came from, where some of these ideas come from, there's a fabulous article from Craig Nelson talking about, the title is Dysfunctional Illusions of Rigor. It's really himself working through and walking himself through the ways that rigor was coded and applied to his situation, and how he began to question that when he went into the classroom and really looked around and saw who was thriving in his classroom and who was not. And one of the important takeaways from this particular article is this idea that so often we are taught to think about our students through a deficit lens, a deficit model. They're not working hard enough, et cetera. Rather, if we pull back and we think about the ways in which our classes are less usefully rigorous, we're actually pulling back the curtain on those deficits. And it's not the deficits that are the issue, it's the fact that we're misapplying rigor. And so we, by revisioning our pedagogy, by revising it, we actually make those so-called deficits irrelevant.
Okay, and so, in this article that Jamiella just talked about, the quote actually came from looking at this study that I'm highlighting here, a Treisman study looking at the performance of African-American students at the University of California, Berkeley, where they saw that African-American students had a high rate of failure in their first semester of math courses. And instead of treating the problem as a deficit in the student, as Jamiella mentioned, they thought about sort of what's the deficit in our curriculum and in our teaching that might be causing this disparity. And so what they did to address this was actually create an honors program. So they did not treat these students as remedial or needing to be fixed, and instead did this honors program where they were using evidence-based practices like group work, bringing in practice for the students, and so on. And what you can see here in this table is that for any given year, in looking at African-American students in this first year mathematics course, those that were not in this honors program had failure rates anywhere between about 40 to 60%, as compared to students that were in the honors program that had a failure rate of 0 to 4%, right? And so this very clearly showed that those who were part of this rigorous program fared better overall, right? And it was a nice demonstration that if we fix the deficits of our teaching, we're able to help students rise to our high expectations, right? We're authentically demonstrating a belief in our students' ability to achieve and providing the proper pedagogical supports to do so. And so this was a really nice example. This is an older example. If you look at, this is from 1990, and since that time, there have been many other studies to show this. Since we don't have a lot of time today, we can't go through a lot of them, but we did want to highlight this one more recent study from Culver et al., which was a larger longitudinal study from 46 four-year institutions in the United States. And they found that classes that used a more rigorous practices, and I'll get into what they mean by that in a moment, correlate with what they were calling intellectual growth, right? And this included the need for cognition, this idea of the need to be challenged intellectually, positive attitude toward literacy, right? A positive attitude toward the skills of our discipline, and critical thinking. With some evidence that these more rigorous classes had a stronger effect on first generation college students in particular, right? And why we wanted to really highlight this and thought this was a really important study was because they were very rigorous in thinking about how they defined rigor and how they looked at classes that were using rigorous practices, right? So they defined rigor as higher order understanding of course content expected by assignments and in-class practices, right? And so as part of this, they were really questioning the adequacy of certain definitions of rigor, and particularly those that centered rigor around things like heavy workload, right? And argued that those definitions, and we will argue too, that those definitions sort of can build in deficit thinking, right? Lead to deficit thinking if students aren't able to meet those quote unquote rigorous expectations of high workload, right? So if a student needs to work outside of class, if they aren't used to that high workload and they're still just getting used to it, if the texts are not accessible, right? These are all reasons why a student may not be able to keep up with a high workload, but it has nothing to do with the rigorous thinking that instructors say that they want, right? And so, again, we're going to think a little bit more, and I'm going to turn this over to Jamiella in just a moment to think about sort of how we can redefine rigor in ways that are a little bit more productive. But I'll just quickly mention that both students and faculty tend to have these misperceptions of rigor as well. And so as we're sort of thinking about how we might redefine rigor, we might think about sort of how can we reframe those ideas for both students as well as faculty.
So we've delivered this as a workshop for instructors a number of times, and as we workshop it, we challenged participants to think about the ineffective ways that they have applied or seen rigor in their courses, their disciplines, or their general context. And so these are just a couple of examples of things that they have come up with. Anything from the amount of reading that we're asking students to do, issues of grade distribution, the time students spend studying. This is a misperception from students as well. It's like, oh, this course is so difficult, I have to study for 6 hours. That's not really a measure of rigor, but it's something that we've bought into. Measuring the content that we've taught, and particularly students struggling through unnecessary ambiguity. And I think that this is a particularly important one, especially as we are in sort of this continued online / hybrid / ambiguous state of teaching. Or what are the ways in which we might have online models or LMSs that are not necessarily, that are difficult to navigate, that are challenging to students, that don't actually allow them to get to those higher order cognition skills. And so we've come up with these 3 principles, and we will include an article at the end of today in order to show some of the expanded definitions of our thinking from this. But what we argue is that principle 1, rigor when defined apart from a deficit ideology, is necessary to teach more inclusively. We need to come to terms with the fact that inadequate definitions of rigor produce poorer learning outcomes, particularly for our underrepresented and underserved students. And then finally, rigor is not hard for the sake of being hard, it is purposeful and transparent. And not to end on a too sour note, because we think that this actually transforms the classroom in really positive ways. I absolutely love this quote from an educator, another American named Christopher Emdin, who in his book writes, "To be an effective educator who creates academically rigorous instruction, one's teaching must be centered around the infusion of life and joy. Academic rigor is about being loud, proud, mobile, unpretentious, and challenged to take on whatever obstacles come one's way, even if they offer some challenge." And we want to just end on that note, because we think that with all of talk about challenging ourselves to redefine this term that has come to be so misused, that we don't want to get lost in that this is something that is supposed to be dour or boring or dull or intense, but positive in really fabulous ways.
And so just to think a little bit, we know we don't have a lot of time here, but just to think a little bit about sort of how these ideas might be applied and how these might inform thinking about the use of educational technologies in particular. And certainly I think the use of educational technologies has been really critical to keeping rigorous education going and to be able to support students as they try to learn remotely or transition between sort of remote and in-person instruction. And so, we came up with a couple ideas of how educational technologies have been used to support rigor. But as I talk through these, we'd love to hear some of your thoughts and your observations of how educational technologies have been used to support rigor. But we thought about how LMSs in particular could be really helpful to provide a structured path through the use of modules, so that if students have to be absent for a certain period of time, they'd be able to see sort of what's going on in the course and keep up. Educational technology is helpful for developing flexible and varied assessments, right? Thinking about principles of universal design, and there's many different tools, some of which that were mentioned here today, that could be used for that, and that educational technologies have allowed us to continue collaborations even remotely by creating collaborative workspaces. And so these were just some of the things that we were thinking about. I'm sure you all have many other different examples. And, we just want to say thank you for giving us the opportunity to share our thoughts with you today. And we hope that this framing will be helpful for you in your own work. This is something we've been working on for a while. And if you'd like us to bring this to your institution, feel free to reach out to either one of us. And actually, we'll drop a link to some further references and reading, since this was such a short time together. But there's a lot more here. So love to hear your ideas and any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was another fantastic talk. We do have a question, and I believe Rebecca Stewart has a hand up. Rebecca, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, my question is, I wondered how student self-efficacy it can be incorporated with this idea of rigor, and how is that a balance that needs to be found between supporting self-efficacy and supporting engagement with a rigor that's there? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I don't know, Jamiella, if you have any initial thoughts, but I would see these two going very hand in hand, right? I think thinking about sort of how can we remove barriers, right? And I think then that allows us to put learning more in the hands of students, right? And we give them the supports to do it, but it's not about saying here's the recipe for how to approach this really challenging task, right? That really challenging task still needs to be there. And I think by eliminating a lot of the barriers, you're helping students feel more empowered to do that, right? We get discouraged if we run into barrier after barrier. And so I feel like they are very interrelated. And so that's sort of my initial thoughts. I don't know if Jamiella, if you have anything to add to that.
Just briefly, a lot of the main research on inclusive teaching is this idea that communicating high expectations and the student's ability to meet it. So I think that in that sense, we can encourage student self-efficacy, but we have to be very careful and very, very aware of issues like stereotype threat and racism in the classroom and those kinds of settings that provide barriers to student self-efficacy.
Fantastic, thank you. And someone said just in the chat there, it would be grateful if you could share the Chronicle article that you mentioned. But thank you so much. I'm so sorry to do this, but we are going to have to stop eventually, so we're going to have to draw the event to a close. But